Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Kato. Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski addressed the country's parliament this week and took the opportunity to raise a number of political tensions on everyone's mind, both in the coalition government led by Prime Minister Donald Tusk and in the president's office headed by President Karol Nawrocki. To tell you more about what is happening on Poland's domestic political scene, let's bring in Aleks Szczerbiak, a professor of political science at the University of Sussex. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. So, foreign policy is led by the government, and the president should fall in line as a representative of this policy. This is an issue the government has voiced several times, arguing this is embedded in the Polish constitution. Now, before we get into this issue, I want to bring in a soundbite from Radosław Sikorski's Wednesday address to Parliament.
Anyone who would attempt to pursue a foreign policy at odds with the government would not only violate the constitution to which you swore allegiance, but would undermine Poland's effectiveness and impede the realization of its interests. On the authority of the Prime Minister, let me declare, when you speak out against the European Union, you're not representing Poland's position, but only your own and that of your office.
So what more can you tell us about the president's international diplomacy activities and Radosław Sikorski's vision?
So I think the first thing is to put these remarks into context. I think that one of the things the government is trying to do is to move on to the front foot on this issue. I think the problem with the sabotage is that it does raise some awkward questions for the government about the fact that they had the people involved in it on their radar, that they were able to get back across the border. The information that was provided at the beginning was when the incident happened wasn't very clear. So this is the kind of the broader context. But the interesting thing is that they are trying to use this as an opportunity, not just to attack the opposition, but to also put the president on the back foot. And that's because they see the president as, I suppose, the biggest obstacle really to the government recovering after it lost the presidential election earlier this year. In terms of the specific issue, so I think there is a real difference here about what representing Poland abroad means. The government interprets this in a rather narrow way. It's basically the president is a kind of a government spokesman. Gets up and he talks about what the government's policy is every time he talks about these issues or if he does a foreign visit. Mr. Nawrocki has a much more expansive view of this. He sees himself as, because he's the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, particularly on things like security issues, as having a much more expansive role, particularly in things like relations with the US, where he has a much better relationship with the Trump administration. So I think what's at stake here is different interpretations of what representing Poland abroad means. Is it a very narrow sense, or is it a much more expansive sense within a bigger political context of the fact that these two are the big political adversaries at the moment, the government and Mr. Nawrocki?
So you mentioned that President Nawrocki is the commander of the armed forces in the context of his diplomatic efforts. Can you tell us a little bit about Radosław Sikorski's diplomatic activities and what his vision is?
Yeah, so I think that the difference here between the two camps is that Radosław Sikorski very much sees building closer relations with Poland's EU allies, or what you might call the European mainstream, as critical in terms of Poland's future security guarantees. And he's trying to present any criticisms of the EU and of EU unity as threatening Poland's security, because he says ultimately, Poland needs to work with its European partners, with Germany, with France, to strengthen the European defence dimension, and that anybody who criticises that and undermines European unity is, on the one hand, threatening to actually undermine Poland's membership of the EU, but also, he would argue, objectively playing into Mr. Putin's hands by weakening the West. I think Mr. Nawrocki and the opposition have a very different view, which is why whereas they would like other European countries to spend more on defence, to contribute more to collective security, as Poland is doing, nearly 5% of GDP is spent on defence. At the end of the day, it thinks that Poland's only credible military security guarantor is the United States. And therefore, any attempts to develop a European defence identity independently of NATO and not including the United States are fruitless in its view. And I think that's the fundamental difference between Mr. Sikorski's approach to this and the approach of the opposition and Mr. Nawrocki, what they see as the role of the EU and Poland's role within the EU within the context of security.
I want to move on to the Russian threat. Are the government and the president's approach to the Russian threat and EU relations different? Does it reflect a deeper strategic disagreement between them?
I think that, where they both agree is that Russia is a serious, if not the most serious, military security threat to Poland. And they can, if on occasions, work very closely together. I mean, we saw that after in the immediate aftermath of the drone incursions that happened in September, the Russian drone incursions, where they were, very much on the same page. And that's a kind of interesting contrast to the way that they've responded to the sabotage attacks, where essentially the two sides have ended up criticising each other. So I think, there is certainly common ground here, and they do both perceive the big threat to be Russia. The difference is, I think, first of all, in terms of how Poland should conduct its relations with the EU, and in terms of how important that is to Poland's security architecture. I've talked about that earlier. But also, I think, in terms of Poland's relations with Ukraine. I think, obviously both sides support Ukraine and want it to win the war because the big strategic threat is Russia. But I think that Mr. Nawrocki thinks that Poland needs to be a bit more assertive in its relations with the EU. He feels that whereas Poland and Ukraine have common interests in terms of stopping Russian expansionism and specifically making sure that the war in Ukraine ends on terms favourable to Kyiv, he also thinks that there are issues where Poland and Ukraine have different interests, economic issues, but also in different assessments of history. And also in terms of his view of the kind of rights and benefits that the Ukrainian minority in Poland, the Ukrainian community, should be entitled to. So here, I think there is a somewhat different approach. So I think these are the two big areas of difference. Firstly, what's the role of the EU and of Poland's Western allies in this process? And secondly, how assertive should Poland be at the same time while providing Ukraine with military, diplomatic, humanitarian support? How assertive should it be in standing up for its interests?
Now I want to move to the events of this week. The government has announced that it will close the Russian consulate in Gdańsk before the year is out. But the opposition figures argue that this is not enough. What additional steps could Poland take to respond effectively to hybrid threats?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting example of where basically it's what political scientists call a valence issue, which is where the two sides kind of agree about the objective and even agree about some of the measures that need to be taken. The opposition isn't criticising what the government's doing in terms of strengthening Poland's border or trying to increase security against hybrid threats, or indeed closing the Polish consulate in Gdańsk. It's really about who's the most competent at delivering this. And that's where I think the argument is taking place. So really, the opposition isn't actually criticising the measures the government's taking. It's simply saying it's too little and too late. So, for example, they're actually questioning, the opposition will question the actual status of the Russian embassy, for example, and the whole question of, whether Poland should have diplomatic ties with Moscow at all.
But I'm just going to jump in there. I'm just going to jump in there. What other steps do you expect or think that the government should take on the back of what we're just talking about? And what kind of weight do you think that actually closing the consulate will carry?
I think it's a symbolic gesture, basically. I don't think it's really going to have that much impact. It's really, being seen to respond in a way that Poland recognises that what's happened this week is actually a serious escalation in terms of the conflict between Russia and the West. It's the first time you've had what's called a kinetic conflict, which is, actually rather than, unarmed drone missiles coming through to Poland's territory, actually an attempt to actively sabotage Polish territory, sabotage on Polish territory. I think that I don't know whether, in practical terms, it actually makes too much difference. These are really kind of symbolic gestures. I think that the more important things are things like strengthening Poland's border security, so that, for example, the guys who are responsible for this don't get in and out of the country very, very easily. Strengthening intelligence in terms of identifying these kind of threats much sooner. I mean, I think these are more the kind of things that the opposition will press the government to do. I think the consulate closure and indeed any kind of diplomatic measures are really symbolic ones, but then politicians have to be seen to be responding symbolically to something that is seen as a significant escalation in tensions between Poland and Russia.
Well, we've got Operation Horizon that is being implemented with military support. Anyway, Professor Aleks Szczerbiak, Professor of Political Science at the University of Sussex, thanks so much for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And that's a wrap for World Talks. Thank you so much for being with us, and stay tuned for much more on TVP World. Goodbye.